In this video, we will learn about the different types of services that you can create in Altogic, the building blocks of services, and how services are executed. In short, in Altogic, you can create three different types of services: endpoint, messaging, and task services. The endpoint services are executed when one of your endpoint is called by your front end or some other third-party application. The messaging services are executed when you send a message to the specific message queue, and the task services are executed when a specific task schedule happens, the time comes, and the service is triggered by Altogic automatically. So, these three types of services, but the modeling of all these three types of services are very similar to each other. Let's see how we can model a service. So we will be creating an example endpoint. In our case, the name of the endpoint will be create books. Okay, create a book, actually create a new book, which will basically create a book in the books collection, books model. And the method will be post. Since we will be creating something in RESTful API, we use post method, and the path will be books. Okay. So whenever a REST API is made to this path, post request is made to this path, then Altogic will execute the associated service with this endpoint. So let's create a new service for this one. Create new book service. Okay, we created the endpoint. Now we need to define the details about the service. So let's get into the service details. Either I can click on here or go to the services tab and click on the newly created service. When I open the service designer, on the center part of the designer, I see the service flow. This is the area where I basically define the flow or define the business logic of my service. On the left hand side, you see the nodes library. These are the list of predefined nodes that you can use in your service flow. Okay, so let me give you an example. Get object value. Okay, the rectangles that you see here on this flow diagram is called a node. Basically, they are specific units that perform some action for given inputs and produce some outputs. The inputs are represented as circles above the rectangle, node rectangle, and the outputs are represented as again circles below the node rectangle. Each node might have different number of inputs and might also have different number of outputs. By the way, the inputs and the output types can change, and whenever you see a circle with a single dash inside that circle, meaning that this input is basically input for a single object. Okay, but there are some other input cases. For example, sort works on a list of objects. In this case, within the circle there are two dashes, meaning that this node object, this node basically gets a list of objects as input, not a single object, but a list of objects, array of objects. For some others, for example, output can be represented as, let's say, filled circle within the circle. This represents an output of a type of value, meaning that it can be either a single object or a list of objects. I will give you an example of how it works in a few seconds later, but this is another type. What else we have? We also have some other link point input types. Input type we circle without anything inside it. This is a trigger input, meaning that this will not get any kind of, let's say, input object or list of objects. This is basically will be used to trigger the execution of the service. So each node has inputs and outputs. Predefined number of inputs, or let's say dynamically change number of inputs. For example, when you see a thick blue line top border for the nodes, this means that this node can take additional inputs. How is that possible? If I drag and drop one of the outputs to this node and drop it over it, then I can add additional input. Similarly, for this one, I can add additional input to that one. So there is no limit on the number of inputs that I can add to a node. Okay. Additionally, each node also have some specific parameters. When you click on a node, on the right hand side, the properties panel is displayed, and each node has some custom properties, but each node also has some common properties like the description of the node, the input link points and output link points. So you can, for example, change the name of the inputs or change the name of the output link points through the common tab on the properties panel. One additional property that you can set for each node, whether you would like to handle the errors that occur during the execution of that specific node, either automatically or manually. If you would like to handle the errors occurred during the execution, then you need to select the manual error handling. In that case, Altogic automatically adds an additional output to this node, which is basically a list of error objects. But most of the time, you will be letting Altogic to handle the errors automatically. But for finer control, you can also do manual error handling. Another important thing that you need to know is the business logic or the service flow is defined by connections or relations between nodes. What I mean by that, so this is a start node. This is basically used to provide input parameters to our service. What you need to do is that you need to connect the input parameters to some nodes that will be executed. So in this case, we will be connecting the start node to the get object value. This is basically dragging and dropping from the output of the node to the input of the other node, and basically we will be creating a connection relation between these nodes. Another one, for example, that we can add is create single object. This is a node that we use to create an object in the database. Similarly, we drag it, drop it, output from the output to the input, and finally we can create single object with the return success response node. So basically, you define the flow execution sequence of the nodes using the relations. Of course, we need to customize the parameters, right? For start node, since this will be like a create a new book service, we should expect that an input book object, single book object, is provided in the body of the request, right? Then whenever we get the body of the request to the get object value, we need to pick the body part of the request, because the request object can provide additional parameters to our service, and one parameter will be the body of the request. So we will be getting the body. Just double clicking on that one, and it will be showing the input.body. The next thing that we need to do is, okay, we've got at this point we've got the book object that needs to be created in the database. Then we are passing this input, passing these parameters as input to the create single object. So what create single object will do is that it will insert or create a new record in the books collection books table, and after that one we will be, after successful execution, we are passing the created object to the return success response. The return success response is basically the last node that is executed during the execution of the service. Its main purpose is basically returning response back to the calling parties. Since we didn't connect any other output as an input to this node, it will just return a success code, HTTP 200 code to the calling party. If you would like to return the created object, then I need to drag and drop this output as input to the return success response node. In this case, it will both return a success response, but on top of that one, it will also return the created object, the object that is created in the database, as a response. Another interesting thing that I would like to show to you is, for example, when we click on the create single object, for example, there's a property called parent object ID. In our case, we don't use this field because I mean the book object doesn't have a parent. It's by itself a top-level object, so we don't need to provide the project parent object ID. But to show you a feature of Altogic, when I click on this one on the expression editor, I see a tab called input. Okay, the input is basically this input. So the input that we will be getting in this case is a book. So I will be getting a book object, and I can use its properties in my expressions. What happens if I drag and drop an additional field to this one. So besides input, I've got also request input. What happens on the expression editor? So I've got the input here, but on top of that one, I've got a new tab, the request tab, meaning that I can also use the values provided by the request model, request object. So this is another important feature of Altogic. So it's quite flexible that you can pass any number of different type of parameters as input to the execution of your nodes. Okay, so far, I mean, we reviewed about what a node is, what a relation is, what's an input, what's an output, and the node parameters. One important thing that you should also know is that you cannot connect output to every input. The type of the connection should be very similar. So, for example, this is an object output. I'm connecting it to an object input. This is a value output. I'm connecting it to an object input because the value output can be either object or list. In this case, it's output object. So I can connect it to let's say input object. An object or a list can be connected any trigger. It doesn't matter. But in case you have, for example, lists like sort object, so it's got an output of list. I cannot connect this one to an object because the object input expects a single object. I cannot pass a list of objects as parameters. So Altogic will not allow this connection. Just take into consideration that you cannot connect everything to other. You cannot connect from one output to an input unless they've got similar, let's say, types or similar data types that they are carrying. Okay, so we connected. We defined our basic, let's say, service. How this service is executed? How Altogic runs this service? What happens is the following: whenever we get this, whenever our endpoint create new book endpoint is triggered, whenever a post request is sent to this endpoint, Altogic wraps all the input parameters, the body, let's say the query string parameters, the headers, request headers, and so on, and wraps everything into a request object. The main purpose of the start node is basically dispatching this request object to the connected nodes. So the first node that will be executed will be the start node. It will be executed and it will trigger all the nodes that are connected to its output. In this case, get object value will be triggered. The request object will be moving from here to here. This will be activated. Get object will realize that, okay, I'm ready to run. Then Altogic will run this node. As a result of this node, the output will be sent to input of the create single object. In this case, this node will become active because it's got only one input, and the input is basically provided with an object. Then this will be executed, and finally, the output result of the create single object will be passed to the return success response node. In that case, this node will become active and it will be executed, and this will be the final node that will be executed in service. Another interesting thing I need to also mention is that, for example, let's say return error response. For some reason, you wanted to raise an error. Okay. So what happens is the following: get object value node is executed, then get object value will trigger both create single object and return error response nodes. Okay. Most probably this object will be executed first because I added this node at a later step, but whenever the return error response node is executed, Altogic stops execution of the service, meaning that even if I execute this one, this node, return success response node, will not be executed. Similarly, if I put a return success response node here, whenever this node is executed, if there are some remaining nodes which are active for execution, Altogic will ignore execution of those nodes and stop execution of the service, because these return error or return success or return file response nodes are typically the final nodes that are being executed throughout the execution of a service, and whenever one of them is executed, the overall execution of the service stops. Okay, so that's overall the anatomy of a service. Basically, we learned what are the different types of services that you can create in Altogic, the building blocks of services like the nodes and the relationships between these nodes and the configuration parameters of the nodes. And we also learned about how services are executed in Altogic. Basically, the services are executed in a predefined flow, and you define the flow which node will be executed by using the relations between nodes. Thank you for watching.